History is, for most of us, one of those subjects that we often get through to graduate. For some, however, it becomes a passion so much so that the past becomes just as important as the present. Now, when David approached me about interviewing our next guest, I got to admit, the topic seemed a bit dry. But as I discovered during the course of our interview, nothing could have been further from the truth. So, as the saying goes, sit back, relax, and enjoy a good lesson in architectural preservation with Jean Becnel Sr. right here on the Rainy Cajun.
Hey, folks, welcome back to the Rainy Cajun podcast. It's been, well, we got a few episodes that have been out, but I think it's been a while since we've done it in the studios.
We've had a busy winter. That's for sure. So there's been a lot going on.
But we're pleased to have with us Jean Becnel Sr. from Louisiana, a preservationist, and I think what's the term? Ebonist?
Well, ebonist would refer more to a furniture maker. I haven't really gone by that much lately because I've been doing a whole lot of furniture, but that's where I started, was as an ebonist, which would be a furniture maker.
Our families go way back, at least 4 generations or so, intertwined, and you and I actually have known each other for, I guess, about a decade or so from the Vacherie Forum and online, but we actually met once at Laura Plantation during the wildfire.
Right.
As you talked about, you're a preservationist and you primarily deal with the Louisiana, I guess, I would say historical homes, but not necessarily in the sense of all the big grand homes that everybody sees.
We do work on a lot of, I guess I would call them stately, large plantation houses, pretty grand stuff. But we also still work on modest things. And that's really where my heart lies, is in the everyday working man thing. And that probably comes from my time at LSU. I was over the preservation efforts at the Rural Life Museum at LSU. Yeah. And that really was the mission of the museum, was the working man. There's no plantation houses there. It goes from very, very humble buildings up to the overseer's house. So all of those in between, it encompasses everyone except the plantation owner. So it's the everyday working man's thing. And we, as a country, we don't really do a great job of documenting those people, and people think of the South, they think of plantation houses and all that stuff. They don't think about the everyday working guy. And that's really where my heart is: furniture and houses and history. But we do it all.
That's one of the things that I really enjoyed about that location, was the fact, because it's right in the middle of, I guess not in the middle of downtown Baton Rouge, but you wouldn't realize how much you're surrounded by the city.
There's that misconception that Louisiana was just or the South in general really was as portrayed in TVs and movies and stuff like that. That's really not the case. It was very much a few wealthy people, and then a lot of people just trying to survive, a lot of people trying to get by. Only about a quarter of our ancestors that attempted to come here in those first couple of waves even made it to Dauphin Island, Alabama, where they disembarked and they made the trip by ferry and by foot to the New Orleans area, and then St. John's Parish, St. Charles, St. John, and then later St. James Parish. Right. It was not an easy time, and it continued to not be an easy time for a lot of people, a lot of orphans, a lot of hard work.
It's interesting to read back about that first wave, I guess, in the 1720s, of the Germans coming to St. Charles Parish and talking about just how they had to clear the land. And I mean, they had to clear everything. I mean, there were some, I know, Indian settlements, Native American settlements that were there that were abandoned at that point that they were able to settle in. But I know also a lot of it was for them to, before I guess they could even farm, they had to clear things out. And then they had to get, and I guess the fortunate aspect, which is something I guess what you'll be able to talk a little bit more about, is that the bounty of just those natural levee from Mississippi River, and you have all that, the real fertile land that comes off of it, but then it goes and it backs up into swamps, right? And when you had the massive cypress trees and all around there.
Sure. A lot of what we consider home was built by the Mississippi River, right? So it's the deposit of soils over the years. And so it's very fertile land. We stripped the rest of the country of their fertile
Yeah.
land and deposited it down here in God's country. Let
Yeah.
you. And but yeah, there was high areas. There was basically bluffs that followed the river, and you and I families, and this isn't anything news to anybody, but you and I families, they settled in Osberg and Marienthal, was the two earliest settlements on the German coast.
Hmm.
But we can't really talk about Louisiana history and the agricultural history of Louisiana unless we also acknowledge St. Genevieve, Missouri, and Natchitoches. So
Right.
St. Genevieve and Natchitoches and New Orleans all started about the same time, Parisian French settlements. And I want to say that St. Genevieve and Natchitoches were more Parisian settlers coming down the river as opposed to going up the river.
I
But
think
we
that's
all
right.
have about the same timeline, a lot of shared history. I've spent a lot of time in those two places because we have so much in common. What we don't have left here as far as house types has survived to some extent in St. Genevieve and in Natchitoches. And by St. Genevieve and Natchitoches, I'm talking about Natchitoches, Louisiana, and St. Genevieve, Missouri.
Right.
And there was probably a little bit more prolific farming early on in St. Genevieve, because at the point where they started with agriculture and Natchitoches did, they were a bit established already at the point where the Germans came into the German coast. So
Okay.
there's lots of different layers and levels to the early settlement of Louisiana, but there was a large trade that happened between St. Genevieve and Natchitoches and the German coast and New Orleans, and there was a lot of grain produced, and so a lot of the food for the early lower Louisiana territories or areas came from other settlements on the river.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess the other thing too, which kind of reminded me of one of the interviews I saw you do, I guess 9 or 10 years ago, is that the descriptions of the style of houses, because the period we're talking about, like we said, is the 1720s, and those who are familiar with their Louisiana history know that the Acadians didn't come down until primarily the 1760s. So all we're talking about is what would you, I think y'all described as would be more Creole in style. Creole meaning of the area, I guess is what y'all had described it as.
Yeah, so my understanding of Creole, I like to use Dr. Holden's definition in the book Furnishing Louisiana. Dr. Holden's a dear friend, a fantastic collection of Louisiana furniture, probably one of the most important collections of houses and furniture in Louisiana. And it's a fantastic book. If you have any interest in it, check out Furnishing Louisiana by Dr. Holden and Pat Bako. They talk about lower Louisiana, upper Louisiana valleys.
Okay.
So yeah, the early houses initially, I wouldn't call them Creole initially.
Okay.
By definition, Creole, and again, to borrow Dr. Holden's definition, would be of here. So when he talks about Creole horses or Creole tomatoes or Creole people, it tends
Hmm.
to mean somebody who was born on this land.
Right.
Um, and so those early settlers, that they weren't born here, but they were coming here and finding a way. There was a lot of temporary housing because ultimately, you're hitting the woods and you're surviving. So you just need a way to keep the rain off your head and you can stay dry and stay warm at night. They borrowed a lot of building practices from their past, their history. That's where we get Norman trusses and we get the vertical log cabins in St. Genevieve and Natchitoches and post in the ground building. But the early stuff, they borrowed the adobe building practices that was practiced by the Native Americans. So when we talk
Mhm.
about adobe in the Midwest, it immediately brings to mind, the little mud huts and the different building construction. But
Right.
Busiab is a derivative of adobe construction. And early houses would have been very crude, and they borrowed a lot of technology from the Native Americans in the construction. Roofs probably consisted primarily of palmetto leaves and cypress bark or other types
Okay.
of bark. They were round huts. There's a fantastic illustration. It's in the Newberry Library in Chicago. They were kind enough to send me high resolution scans of it. I want to say it's John Law's Concession. There's some pictures of it,
Okay.
snips of it in the Furnished in Louisiana book, and they're also on my blog that I haven't dealt with in probably 15 years. It's just still out there. But it shows the early building construction. It's some palmetto huts. It's they're building a church. They're steam bending timbers for a ship. They're building barrels. It's a really insightful drawing, and it's the size of a wall. I mean, it's a huge
Hmm.
drawing. Paint ink on canvas, and the idea is the guy is sitting off the coast drawing this illustration of what he sees.
Hmm.
But that's definitely worth checking out for anybody who's interested in Louisiana history.
Is it when you were referring to the Adobe? What was it? What
Bousillage.
is it? Not bustier, but bousillage. Is that the mud and the moss and all that's done in between the walls? Okay, because when we were at Jeremy and I visited Homa's house when we were down in February, and Chef Jeremy Langlois took us into the carriage house and back there, and he was showing us where a lot of the, I guess, plaster had come down, and you could see it. And I know I've seen it at Lar too, where you can actually see I guess in that case it's 250-year-old horsehair that's still embedded in the mud there. But that was basically what you had, the timbers, and then you had it filled in between with that's material like you were talking about. Is it a mixture also? Was it oyster shells too?
So I'll bust some myths here, bust some
Okay,
things here. Um,
good.
I don't know of any horsehair in bousillage.
Okay,
Um, and that's generally accepted as one of the things. I'm not aware of any horsehair in actual bootshot that's been studied. There's been a lot of
okay.
stuff. There are cases of so the oyster shells would be we're trying to find lime, and that comes in later boutillage. Essentially, we're trying to harden the mud,
Hmm.
and so they would burn oyster shells. We actually lost, unfortunately, quite a few Native American shell mounds, and there's still some of those left in Back Factory, as you probably know about.
Yeah,
There's actually an area called Shell Mound or Shell Hill, rather. But we
yeah.
lost a lot of native burial sites and shell mounds to excavating these clam shells that came from Lake Desalmon to burn them to make lime for bricks, for mortar, rather not bricks,
Hmm.
but for mortar and for bousillage. But back to the bousillage, it would be moss and mud,
Okay.
and it looks like horsehair because it's a black fiber that's in the middle of the moss. And if you look at moss in the trees, it's got a grayish green kind
Right.
of coating to it. We'll kind of refer to that as the bark of the moss.
Okay.
And there was a long misconception about the moss was retted. And what that
Yeah.
means is it was prepared in a way to get rid of that bark. But every example of bousillage that has been studied that I'm aware of, there's evidence that the moss wasn't retted. The retting came later, and it was done to use it in mattresses and pillows and things like that. So it was literally moss out of a tree in a pit with mud, stomped on it for a while, and then we made something called a tableau, and that is essentially it's a pad of moss, a rectangular pad of moss and it's draped over the rabos in the wall, I'm sorry, barres in the wall, and that's how it was filled. And then once that all dried, you would skim it over with a little bit more wet mud to smooth things out, and then you would whitewash it. And then if you had a prolific year of planting or trading or whatever it was, then you might put siding over it.
Okay. So that about what period of time did that start from the original settlers in the 1720s, or was that sometime after?
Yeah, that would have been early on, and really, like I said, it's a derivative of it's just a form of adobe. But the purpose of bousillage is thermal mass and insulation. So if you're, and it's very. Are you familiar with the swamp cooler? How evaporative cooling works? Like in the
If,
Midwest, where they have lower humidity levels, they use things
right,
called swamp coolers, and it
right.
doesn't use a compressor like what we use for AC now. It just basically blows water over, I mean, air over water, and the evaporative
Hmm.
effect cools the air, right? So the bousillage, it has a lot of different purposes. When you're burning a fireplace in the winter and you warm up, whether it's a log cabin or a bousillage house, it's referred to as thermal mass. So you're raising the temperature of the structure. It's like
Hmm.
if you've been on vacation and you have your AC set really low for 2 weeks and you get back home and it takes forever to cool the house, right?
Yeah.
But when the house is already cool, it cools down quicker. So the thermal mass of the furniture, the walls, everything in the house has a role to play in keeping the house cool. So or
Hmm.
warm rather in this case. So we're running the fireplace, we're warming the house. It tends to stay warmer. In the winter, we've got cross ventilation and we've got an evaporative effect because water is being drawn up from the ground through capillary action, the same
Hmm.
way it is in historic buildings in New Orleans. And we can talk on that a little bit, but this is a big part of why the buildings are falling in disrepair. But so capillary action draws water up through the bousillage, it evaporates into the walls, and the evaporative effect cools the air as it passes through the house. So it has a cooling effect in the summer, and it assists us and aids us in staying warm in the winter.
Hmm.
And then prior to a true bousillage house, you would have used the same material as what's called to refer to as chinking on an English timber
Okay.
frame, where the logs are put together and then they're sealed between the logs with daubing, mud, whatever materials you might have.
It served a purpose, is what it was, not just from eye pleasing, but also from comfort.
Absolutely. That's one of the biggest things that I think we lost touch with is that prior to I'm gonna get some hate for this, but the 1950s and 60s never should have happened architecturally speaking. Modern art is just horrible, and architecture is terrible. I despise modern the 1950s, 60s, 70s architecture, unless we start talking about like Haystown or something like that, who kind of brought the traditional stuff back.
Yeah.
But it was a divergence from the thousands of years of history that we had as a people who've always involved natural building materials into houses and useful everyday items. It was a
Hmm.
divergence from form follows function. And by that, I mean, houses and furniture and things were built in a way that they worked in unison with nature and they worked in a way that things looked a certain way because that was the way in which they functioned best. Now, not to
Right.
take away from, oh, so every time I talk about this too, with like students or stuff like that, it inevitably ends up in medieval art and the classics and all the spectacular church
Right.
paintings and church architecture and stuff like that. And I'm not referring to that. There's obviously beauty that wasn't 100% function.
Right.
There's always been a concept of beauty and the golden proportions and so, but I told you earlier, I'm more about the working man guy. So the form followed the function, and there were basic aesthetic principles that we followed in addition to that. I tend to refer to it as a rule of thirds. Architects have talk about it in different ways, but generally speaking, like for example, an Acadian table or Creole table is going to be 1/3 in width that it is in length,
Okay.
and a door or a window is going to be 3 times higher than it is wide. That's the aesthetics that we enjoy looking at. And
Okay.
there's nothing wrong with that. And when it's not right and you try to reproduce something and the aesthetics are not correct, it doesn't look right even if you can't put your finger on it. There's certain
Hmm.
aesthetic principles that we really need to kind of adhere to for things to look right. But yeah, there was this big change. And so we started forcing materials into our will in a sense instead of working with them. So
Right.
the Portland cements, the modern materials, the moisture barriers, there's roofing applications, all these different things we thought were like revolutionary, wonderful things, and they are obviously for modern building. But the issue came in when we started getting concerned in preservation, and we started forcing those materials into historic buildings that were never intended to work in that way.
Hmm.
Um, and so suddenly we've done more damage than good. And it's hard to know that initially.
Right.
We're making best guesses. None of it was done with ill will. It was all, good intentions. But my job security now as a preservationist, a conservationist, is because of the terrible preservation work that was done in the 60s, 70s, and 80s,
Hmm.
and even into the 90s, really. You mentioned you were familiar with the Rural Life Museum.
Right.
So that started as Steel Burden's middle of the night, last dash effort to save a collection of buildings that were going to be torn down.
Okay.
And that was the Wellham Plantation. in St. James Parish. So Marathon bought that. Fortunately, he found out about it. They gave him permission to move the building. It's all the slave cabins and the overseer's house. And luckily he was able to move those buildings out of harm's way. And then the big house was torn down at 3 o'clock in the morning, despite all the protests from people. And they showed up out there with machinery, in the dead of the night so that there wouldn't be any
Controversy.
Yeah. And so that incident, that occurrence is really what created not only the Rural Life Museum, but also the Louisiana Trust for Historic Preservation. That's when it became apparent that there needed to be something here in Louisiana that covered the state that was involved in making sure that historic buildings were properly cared for. And they were a big push in getting what we enjoy now as tax credits for historic preservation work. So there's a lot of advantages tax-wise and a lot of assistance that you can have from the state and the federal government if you want to save a historic house. So I encounter it daily. A house is on the National Registry, or it's recognized as a historic structure in a community. And the idea and the mindset is that once it's on this magical list, nobody can tear it down. Nobody can damage it. Nobody can do anything. And that's just simply not true. So if it's private property, which most of them are, or there's the state or federal government or nonprofit, if it is property, you can do with it what you wish. So industry buys a historic house on the National Registry, they can run a bulldozer through it. It's theirs to do what they want. If your brother, cousin, family member, whatever owns a house on the National Registry and they're not taking care of it, it's their property to do with what they wish. If they want to bulldoze it, they want to burn it to the ground. There is zero protection afforded to a historic building simply for being on a registry list somewhere. That's another, while I'm on that, it's another place where the Louisiana Trust comes in, is they'll write preservation easements on historic buildings. So if you have a historic building and you want to sell it, but you're concerned about what might come of the building if you sell it, they'll help you through the legal side of writing a preservation easement or a protection easement. So for ever and ever and ever and ever and ever, you can't tear it down and you can't do the wrong things with it. Okay, so they can actually put those constraints on a building. Being on the National Registry does not do that. You have to go through other means. Being a historic house does not entitle you to free money. Okay, it is not because I own a historic property, somebody's going to give me money to fix it. That's just not how it works. There are some grants out there occasionally you can get, and there are tax credits, like I mentioned earlier. They can range anywhere from 19%, so 19 cents on a dollar, to 55 cents on a dollar. And that is taken over 5 years after once the project's complete. Those are really, really great incentives for developers to fix historic buildings. It's a weird paradigm in historic houses, because you have people that think that they don't have to be involved or concerned about things because, it's a historic building. It's protected. No, it's not. You need to have a voice, and you need to go out there and you need to get in, you need to form a picket line or whatever in front of the bulldozer and keep it from being torn down. And then the other side of that too is they think, well, I mean, if it's a historic house, surely somebody else is going to take care of it. And really, there's this outrage about the industry that I was talking about earlier that might have some impact on buildings, but there's a lot of social media warriors that get online and talk about how outraged they are. And there's very few people that put their money where their mouth is and make a positive change on these historic houses, right? It's easy to scream from the rooftops that, it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. It's a lot harder to organize, organizations and get people together and fundraise and make positive change for these buildings. That's a lot harder task. And very few people are up to that task. So it's exhausting to hear all of the outrage, but not see the action that should be behind it.
Yeah, I think you and I have seen a few of the same posts a couple of times, and on that, because I remember a few examples in the past. But
are you thinking of San Francisco plantation.
Well, yeah, I know San Francisco is one that's been coming to mind as you've been talking. You and I think there was a couple of postings where some people would post historical properties or something, and they'll make some comments on there that we know aren't accurate, and
I
so
gave up.
yeah,
I
exactly.
gave
That's what
up.
you have to
I
kind
used
of
to try to
step
educate
back.
people, and it's a hamster wheel on social
Yeah,
media, you know. So I'm hoping that maybe some people, and it's not to be insulting to anyone. I want people to be involved and interested in preservation and saving these historic buildings. I just wish there was a little bit more seeking out the education on the things and getting
yeah.
involved, because there's a lot of organizations and community things that you can do to help foster preservation that only take your time.
Hmm.
If you have the resources to donate to things to help them monetarily, that's even better. But there's a lot of things you can do that just cost your time.
You said, and you've talked about it on another video with respect to just education in general, knowing like, like the longevity of materials, for examples, or some of the physics like you talked about with certain materials behave in a certain way that people think you can either just replace it with, fiberglass mock-ups or something else. And there's that education there as well, knowing about how these things were done and what it takes to either bring them back or save them is one of the aspects of it. And like you said, it requires a lot of effort in a lot of cases to make that happen.
Yeah, and I mean, let's be honest, it requires a lot of money. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of money to do these things. I mean, it can be affordable, especially when you start talking about tax credits. But part of my difficulty as a business owner, having a company that does this, is that people don't know we exist,
Yeah.
and people don't know, and that's the sense, not in the sense of our company, but people don't know that there's even that market there. So it's a very niche market, right?
Oh yeah.
So I'll
Yeah,
give the
definitely.
example, the house in Thibodaux, Armitage Plantation. If you're familiar with Thibodaux, bourgeois meat market there on the bayou, Armitage Plantation is there. It's a long storied past, a really historic house. And it was struck by lightning a couple of, I guess about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and almost entirely burned. The entire,
Hmm.
the dormers, the roof, the second floor. The fire department came and made a valiant effort. They eventually stopped it, but there was no fire breaks in the house, so it just spread like crazy through the second floor,
Yeah.
and it burned it up pretty good. Well, they got estimates from a couple of contractors, and they were astronomical. And the
Hmm.
contractors were come in and reframe the house, and it's what it looked like, but they would have done it with Lowe's and Home Depot two buys.
Oh
It's
wow.
not really true to the character of the house, right? It couldn't be anything further from it. And
Hmm.
so I had seen it in the news, and I reached out to the family, and we went down and did a consult. And we ended up doing the project for half of what the highest bidder was.
Wow.
Previous quotes had been, and we completely reconstructed it with pegs, mortise and tenon, rough sawn cypress. So when I say there's a lot of money in it, to doing it right, we actually understand what it takes because we do it. And so a lot of
Hmm.
contractors are afraid of those historic houses because they don't know what they're going to get into. So they'll they compound the price, the estimate to exponential amounts
Right.
because they don't know what they're going to get themselves into.
Yeah. Yeah.
On that token, a lot of times we work cost plus because there's going to be unknowns and surprises for us as well. And the best way
Right.
to take care of both sides is to leave that, possibility. But we generally come in, we estimate, and then give an estimate of what it's going to be. And we have it. Sometimes it goes over, and a lot of times it's because of customer changing their mind along the way or some
Hmm.
unknown sometime. But we do a pretty good job of giving a good estimate, and then a lot of times we're under what the estimate is. But that's one of the other places where we come into play on a historic building is because when you're putting a historic building back together, preserving it, conserving it, you want to have a sensitivity and an appreciation for the original construction, right? You want it to be like
Right.
it was always been. But on the same token, though, you also have to now meet modern building codes.
Yeah.
And so the easiest thing for a traditional contractor, or not traditional, but for a everyday contractor, is they're going to rebuild it in a way that easily conforms to building codes.
Hmm.
Where what we do is we come in with an architect or an engineer, and we figure out how to make it sensible to the original historic building, but still conform to building codes. Simple things like rebuilding the plantation I was talking about in Thibodeau, Armitage Plantation.
Right.
They normally, for code, you would have to include hurricane clips, which is a metal bracket that goes from the top plate to the roof rafter. And it's to keep the roof rafters from pulling off in a hurricane, uplift. Where we don't need that. It messes the aesthetic up of the attic. It's just the attic, but I don't want to go in a historic house and see that, right?
Yeah.
So we use different means of doing that. We use structural lag bolts that are approved for uplift, and it takes 40,000 pounds to shear one of these things. And we drive them through the top down. In fact, we put 2 of them because if one's good, 2 is better. And everything passes code, no problem. It's all fine. But you don't see that. So then you don't. It's just all this modern materials and historic building. I try to stay away from it.
So when you were saying that, that was the other thought I had, was that with, like you were talking about the cost, even if, for example, y'all might have come across as more, which not in this case, but the thing about it is that if you're using modern materials, but you're also trying to tie it in with the older materials, I know you've talked about like the breathing of the woods and stuff, as even though they're supposedly dried out, and the newer woods and the older woods, but the rates and the settlements of how things were done. I mean, if you're using modern techniques, I can imagine at some point that could put stressors on the existing structure, or even on the new structure, because of the way things are.
Yes.
They're so dissimilar in a lot of ways.
I'd say more often in a masonry building. So if you had, let's say, for instance, we're working on right now, and it's a masonry building. I'm going to post all about it when it's done, but I'm basically in an NDA on it right now. So it's a modern masonry building. It was built in 1840. Beautiful house, and needed a lot of love. But the bricks go straight into the ground for the walls. And there was areas of the house that were failing, and we looked at it with an engineer, and we really kind of talked it over, and we considered all the aspects. And the real problem with coming in and doing what a lot of contractors would do, which would be to excavate under the failing portions of the wall, pour concrete, and rebuild it. Well, now I can't move as one. Right now, I've locked this part of the building into, it's never going to move, where the rest of it settle. And so now I'm causing problems in the future because I fixed one problem, and now I'm setting myself up for problems in other parts of the building in the future. So at the end of the day, it made more sense. It was, the thing to do was to take down some of the wall and rebuild it, but still interlocked with the original wall, but not add and not disturb the soil underneath it. So things like that. There's just a lot of elements to this, and we don't really do much masonry work. We rely on subs. So there's a great company out of New Orleans that we work with a lot. They do historic masonry work, and but so we see a lot. In fact, we recently consulted with the church. I think it's Our Lady of Peace in Back Factory.
Yeah,
is that right? Our Lady of Peace. And they're having all kinds of issues with their plaster. Right? Have you been in there? Have you seen the plaster falling off the walls?
No, I know that they took the rectory down recently. I know that they replaced it.
When Father Brad was there, he called and asked me to come out and take a look, and I did. And part of my pause for that building was it was designed by the same architect as the church in New Orleans, and also all of the mortar in the walls of that church came from the shells they excavated out of Shell Mound.
I remember. I think you probably were the one who told me about that. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was there was some reason for pause and concern on that one. So there's a lot of just not knowing and putting modern materials on top of historic materials. So in the case of the church in Back Factory, Our Lady of Peace, they put Portland plaster over the soft brick, and Portland plaster doesn't allow for moisture to move. It doesn't allow for it to breathe. And then on top of that, it looks like latex paint is on top of that. So moisture barriers are great. We want to keep stuff out of our buildings, but moisture barriers don't allow the building to breathe. And in a historic traditional building, it's like I was talking about with the bousillage earlier. Soft brick and mortar in earlier houses were designed to allow moisture to move through them. If the moisture can't exit the brick, you have all these issues with ground salts and popping off. Yeah. There's a lot of there's a lot of elements to a historic building that you really just need a professional to come in and take a look at.
Yeah.
Another one that is absolute, just it's a sore subject for me. I replaced a lot of the roofs at Rural Life Museum when I was there, or quite a
Mhm.
few. Wooden shingle roofs. The state is still speccing wooden shingle roofs the way that they were originally written in the 70s, and it's not right. It's
Mhm.
incorrect. So the roofs rot in about 10 to 15 years when they could last for 30 to 40 years.
Wow.
And the biggest issue with it is they're layering tar paper between their layers of roof because they think that, well, that keeps it from leaking. But in
Mhm.
actuality, it keeps the shingles from drying out. And so the shingles stay wet all the time. And they even though they're cedar or treated cedar, they rot almost immediately. And for that reason, too, we started bringing in materials from South America that are superior to cedar. So we're
Okay.
bringing in hardwood shingles. We're making siding out of Purple Heart in some cases if it's going to be painted. There's a lot of different things that we can do to stay with natural materials, but still have the mindset and work with the historic building and not work against it. We want to work with
Yeah.
nature, not against it, and preserving the building.
Because yeah, I'm thinking of as you're talking, just so many more questions I have, or even things because I've done quite a few of the plantation tours, and even though my appreciation up until this point has really been more from the aesthetics, I've always been fascinated when I hear the stories of like the functionality of things. Um, and so, but one of the, so yeah, I can imagine I may have to come together with some more questions and schedule a part two or something in the
We can do
future.
that. Yeah, we
But
can do that.
yeah,
And we didn't really even talk about how I got here. Not that it's all that interesting, but
I was
I
just
started as
about
a
to ask that
furniture maker.
actually. So,
Yeah. So I started as a furniture maker, and the guy who taught me furniture making was a Wagispack, Mr. Herman Wagispack. Great fella, third or fourth generation furniture maker. It was kind of not really a formal apprenticeship, but sort of like that. So very, very early on, I had an appreciation for traditional trades, and he was able to teach me a lot of it. And then I hit the point where, it wasn't all the internet was helpful. Let me just say that. Roy Underhill, things
yeah.
like that. Those traditional guys, they kept it going. That was really helpful to the journey. And then I figured out I built a lot of furniture. It's been a part of my life since I was 14, building reproduction furniture. I built furniture here. I ended up living in St. Louis and working on historic houses there a little bit, but built furniture to feed myself when I was there. And
Hmm.
then I figured out that houses were just big pieces of furniture that you can live in. So, and Louisiana tradition and history comes from a place where, and the guy who taught me is often the guy building your house was also building your furniture. He
Hmm.
was building your outbuildings, your chicken coop, that sort of stuff, possibly. So it's not a stretch, it's not a reach. Now, a lot of your finer furniture maker stuff that would have been a very specialized person, that would have been an ebonist, like we talked about at the very beginning. And
Right.
an ebonist more refers to somebody who does a lot of veneer inletting.
Hmm.
And there's one furniture maker in particular who he was one of the fellows they thought might have been the butterfly man, which if you're interested in that, you type in butterfly man and Louisiana Armoire and you're going to get all kinds of stuff. That's an interesting read. But one of the guys, and here I am again drawing a blank on his name, but he was believed to be the son of Marie Laveau.
Oh,
And he was a
okay.
furniture maker in New Orleans. So obviously there's a lot of history there.
Right.
Um, it's the name's probably going to come to me here in a second. But I've got one of his armoires in my house,
Oh,
built in
cool.
1820. Where my house is full of Louisiana furniture. That's always been a love for me.
Hmm.
Um, it's getting a little easier to find now too. The prices have come down. The antique market was crazy for a while, and now it's starting to kind of have a lull again, and the prices are a little more reasonable. You can find stuff again.
Yeah, grab them
But
while you can
anyway,
find them.
yeah. But yeah. So furniture maker turned house guy, and that's all. That's been my story ever since. And we work all over the Gulf Coast, really primarily Louisiana, but we'll go anywhere for the right projects. I like to work on interesting projects.
That's what I
We
was going
have
to ask you if y'all did ventured throughout the state, but if you, because I know Mobile has a lot of, uh, well, the houses aren't as old, but we do still have some older uh,
you have a
places along the Gulf
fantastic
Coast.
house. You have a fantastic house there, the Krebs LaPointe house.
Okay,
and
I've heard of
it's
it.
down in below Mobile, and it was I believe, as far as they know, it's the oldest documented house in Alabama, and
Okay.
it was Boussiage, a shell Boussiage infill house. We had actually kind of entertained the idea of doing some maintenance stuff with them, kind of on a scheduled kind of basis for a little while.
Mhm.
Really, really fantastic house, though.
I'll have
Don't
to
say
look it up.
there's a lot of history
Yeah.
there, and if the project's really, really, I mean, we're entertaining going overseas to build some timber frames right now.
Wow.
So, we if it gets juices flowing and it's interesting, I'll definitely consider it and
Yeah.
talk about it for sure.
That's good to know. I guess one of the main question I was thinking about is that, I was thinking from some of the other things you've talked about, and whether it's between the furniture or even the houses, but I imagine that if you do a lot of restoration in a certain area, I mean, there's the first of all, I know there's the story that's being told because as you're pulling back the layers and you're seeing because of these hand tools, I mean, you're seeing that it just amazes the connection with the makers of those. Because I think about that like when I grow my favorite, my Meliton, about who planted this before. And now I'm thinking in your case, you're digging through, you're tearing these timbers, not tearing them, but you're going through and you're looking at it and just the cuts. Each cut tells a story, I have to imagine. And so there's one question is that can you have you worked on enough of the same houses or furniture in an area that you can recognize a certain person style that he made this or this other, or maybe it's too rare to do that, but I know you, like I said, you probably at least appreciate seeing certain
Yeah.
styles or skills.
So, so that's a really, really good question. I will say from the academic standpoint, there's been a lot of work done in that regard on furniture.
Hmm.
So, like the armoire I was just talking about, I know who made it because of the characteristics of it, and it's been studied before. So there's a lot of academic investigation that's gone into that on Louisiana furniture. I'd say there's probably a lot less on buildings. Um, in some cases, we have the documentation to know, in early
Hmm.
court records and things like that. But it's interesting you brought that up though, because a big part of my, it wasn't assigned to me, so I'm not going to say it was my job, but a big part of my interest while I was at LSU was the forensics of the furniture maker. And by that, I mean, everyone knows what CSI forensics and all that kind of stuff is. The tool,
Right.
they study the different elements of things. Now, a little bit of background on me more. My oldest brother is with state police. He runs the state police crime lab. He's a forensic scientist. That's what he's done for 30 years. And my brother, the next brother, is an architect and he's done a lot of Louisiana stuff. And I fall somewhere in the middle. So I didn't go to school for either of those things. I have more degrees probably than I need, but um, my big interest fell really in the middle of those things, where I was really interested in the science behind things, but I was
Right.
also interested in the design and the working on things that were there. And so while I was at LSU, I studied the buildings that we had in the collections and the furniture in the collections, not to associate them with specific builders, but to associate them with building trades and techniques.
Okay.
So going into that, there was a lot of guesses on how things were made. And me being a trades guy, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to use these guesses to now recreate this method of construction, and I'm going to do the same things, and I'm going to build a piece of furniture that looks exactly the same. And in doing so, I absolutely debunked some of the ideas of how things were made. Some of the techniques were really just guesses, and they never tested them. They're like, okay, so these
Oh
marks
yeah.
on this timber, they're the shape of an adze, so clearly that was made by an adze. Well, when you go, all right, well, let me make those marks. You're like, why would anyone do this? There's no
Hmm.
practical purpose for this mark in the way that it's portrayed. So then you go, okay, well, why does this mark exist then? And what process would have made this makes sense in an efficient manufacturing manner, right? Because if I can't recreate it in a way that makes sense,
Right.
and I can't recreate it in any way other than just trying to replicate the marks, then we obviously
Mhm.
don't understand it,
Right.
right? So if I can come up with an efficient process to arrive at that finished good that replicates that mark, now I'm onto something.
Right.
Okay, so it got deep. I was super nerding out on this stuff, right? So in going in, I was like, oh, they don't build it like they used to, and the dovetails need to be perfect and fine and awesome and everything. And then you really look at historic furniture, and you're like, God, these guys were flying through this crap as fast as they could. They're making a living, right? They don't have any interest in spending a week cutting one drawer, the dovetails for one drawer. They're going to do this quick. So, and all
Yeah.
the marks that they use, the marking instruments they use, all those marks are left behind in a lot of cases. But it got to the point, and I had a slideshow for this I used to do at LSU. Um, it got to the point where we could tell if somebody was left-handed or right-handed.
Wow.
And we could tell predominantly what culture they learned the trades in. So, like, were they German? Were they French? Were they Eastern European or something? Were they, so,
Yeah.
and it was
Yeah.
based upon the tool marks and the predominant traditions of that culture. So, in order to learn that, you have to do all this academic research into how did they build furniture, where each major group came from. And now I've got
Hmm.
to bring that back, understand the tool marks that are left there, bring that back here and go,
Hmm.
okay, what are my different elements here? And there's a lot of tools that we have on displays in museums in Louisiana that were never used here on Louisiana furniture. They just happen to be around in the 1920s and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's a misrepresentation.
Wow.
I mean, if I had $1 for every time I walked into a museum of early Louisiana history that talks about logging and see a double bit axe on the wall, I could retire sooner. But they didn't
Yeah.
exist. They didn't exist here
Yeah.
until the 20th century. But they're portrayed as like some early settler acts. And it's just a lack of education. It's not any ill will. It's not anything like that.
Right. Right.
I started to realize that, and that was my driving force in getting so deep in the woods on this, because I was
Yeah.
like, man, all these things I thought were true, I'm just on a roll now. We're gonna figure out and
Yeah.
learn as much as we can about this while we're on this roll. And so we pit
Yeah.
sawed timbers at LSU, and we hand hewed them. And I continue to do that if we're in a museum setting and we need to reproduce a piece of timber that we need the tool marks to be absolutely correct. I get out there with an axe and I hand hew it with that axe and a broad axe, or I get out there and hand saw boards off of a log with a a pit saw that we had custom made in Sheffield, England, that's almost 8 feet long, and was
Hmm.
made by a company there that still had the drawings for when they made them in the 1700s.
Wow. Wow.
So you can get to a level of ridiculousness with this, right? But
Yeah.
we try to walk in between, and we do what we think is best for each individual case. So
Yeah.
everything is a case by case basis. There's no right or wrong answer for every single building. You can't put preservation and conservation into a neat little box and say
Yeah.
that everything applies the same way to every building. End use, available budgets, all these things come into play on it.
Like I said, there's things and that's part of what Jeremy and I've been doing is just trying to learn and educate ourselves and those who are watching. But I'll know a little bit, about something, and then as I'm finding out more about it from the experts like yourself, it becomes even more fascinating because the things that I think of like it on the surface, looking at something on the surface, and then just what you described. I mean, obviously, if anybody didn't realize the level of detail that you spend going and trying to recreate this stuff, because, I mean, I think about it sometimes when I cook a dish or something, and if I want to try to be as authentic to the old recipes and trying to do some of that, but then when you really step back and do it for the different things, whether it's architecture or building or furniture or something else, you really need to think and think about how it was done, and then you learn so much from that. And then, like you said, there's a bunch of misconceptions about things, and hopefully, like I said, people watching today and maybe check out some of the other things you've done will understand that level of detail and thought. And hopefully, if they want to preserve their Louisiana homes or Creole homes or Gulf Coast homes, they'll look into y'all and consult and find out and want to do it right. because maybe they don't even know that there's a potential of doing it wrong.
And that's really what I was saying earlier about one of my biggest hurdles as a business owner is people even knowing that they're not hiring the right person unless they get somebody who does what I do,
Right.
Yeah.
It's just hiring just whatever contractor, and they really just don't know. And then that contractor comes in and doesn't have the knowledge to not mess it up further. When I was talking
Right.
about the concrete mortar and the latex paints and those sorts of things. So, this has been a lifelong thing for me. I have spent my entire life doing this
Yeah.
and involved in this to different degrees. I've had fantastic mentors along the way. Unfortunately, I don't consider myself very old, but I'm at that point where my mentors are starting to pass away, and that's really sad.
I know.
And so, the opportunity to do something like this and to teach. So I'm big on teaching. I'm really, really big on teaching. And that was really the reason I was at LSU in the first place. But I'm starting to come to the realization, though, that we have to start passing this on to the next generation. It's not just, even though I'm still not done learning, I'll never be done learning. You never can. There's so many layers and facets to all these different things that you can take interest in. You're never done. But it's time to start educating the next generation, and the next couple generations. And hopefully, I have 5 sons, so hopefully, no daughters, and I'm okay with that. I have 5 sons. Hopefully, they end up 1 or 2, or have some interest and want to make themselves crazy in this world too. And we get to pass it down in that way too. I mean, we do some furniture stuff together already, but they take an interest in the long haul stuff too.
Well, I hope so. And like I said, hopefully at least you'll be inspiring to others too that'll be interested in learning this. So, but anyway,
I don't think I even mentioned my company name at this point.
No, you haven't. I got a little mental checklist here I'm going through.
Yeah. So it's Architectural Preservation LLC.
We'll put a link.
It's a great name, right? It describes what we do.
Yep.
But the difficulty on that too is if you just go on Google and you type in architectural preservation, you're going to find articles from all over the world about architectural preservation. So we're pretty easy to find on Facebook, though. It's Architectural Preservation LLC. Or if you just type in my name, Jean, Jean Becnel, Becnel, you should be able to find it. So you'll find out all kinds of stuff about me too that I didn't mention here, and stuff I'm trying to bury in the internet. No.
Where are your offices at?
So we're out of Ascension Parish.
Okay.
And we're actually, it's some exciting stuff. I probably shouldn't talk about it yet, but it looks like we're probably going to be acquiring a historic building in Ascension Parish.
Nice.
With a lot of history, a lot of past, and making that our new home for our warehouse and shop space and office space and all that stuff. So that's going to be exciting. That's not quite to fruition yet, but it's coming, and hopefully that can work out. There's a lot of moving parts to it, but I would love nothing more than for somebody who wants to work with us to get to walk in an example of what we do as a place to meet, So
that'd be cool.
That would be super cool for us. We don't have that right now. So, yeah.
Well, Jean, this has been ridiculously informative. I mean, when David brought up your name and everything, and we were talking, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted him to drive the conversation, because he's done so much background research, and he's kind of the the historian / genealogist expert. He's takes care of all that stuff for the family. I mean, in fact, I didn't even know that I was related to Wagasbacks until he and I really got to talking. And it turns out a guy that I went to elementary school with, I've known since kindergarten. He's a Wagasback, and he's my cousin. I had no idea. Yeah. So, and it only took 52 years to figure that out. So, there's a lot of things that you don't know. But I mean, I think some of the points that you make about, people, for lack of a better term, cutting corners, to kind of get things to a certain level that's acceptable versus what should be really done. And that's what you specialize in educating people about that. I think that's super important, because you're going to start to see, like you said, the mentors are going away, and we will be the mentors moving forward. and so we have to carry on as much information, accurate information as possible. And it seems like
Right.
you're doing an amazing job of that.
Oh yeah.
Well, I don't ever get invited to cookouts though. What's going on with that?
Well, that one you got to know the right people for that one. So
I'll post it when I know you know Chef John. I'll post it next time.
yeah, he's invited me out for it before, and I just haven't made it work, and I've kind of lost touch with him over the years. But we're I guess we're somehow distant kin. And,
Oh yeah.
But I used to have, it was quite a hobby for me to do, like make sausage and hams and Coca-Colas and bacon and andouille and tasso, all the fun stuff. Boudin, but just don't really have a lot of time anymore. If anybody out there listening needs a guy who does what we do, we don't work in New Orleans a lot. I try not to because it's like
right.
It's great and all, but there's trouble and problems involved with that too.
Sure.
But we'll go if it's the right project, you know. Yeah. But and give us a call.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Sean.
All right. Thank y'all. Take care. Have a great weekend.
You too.
You too, man.